Jackson supported federal power against the Native Americans, but otherwise he tended, and he supported it against the South Carolina attempt to ignore the tariff. But otherwise, he actually tended to oppose the increase in federal power. He vetoed a bill for a road to be built in Kentucky with federal dollars because it was only in one state; it wasn't interstate. And if there's one government organization that Jackson hated, it was the Bank of the United States, or the Second Bank of the United States, I should say. The bank took federal deposits. I mean, when the government collected taxes or tariffs or whatever, they put them into the Second Bank of the United States. The bank took these deposits and printed paper money. Now, I should point out that money at the time could be traded in for gold. So the bank could only print as much money as they have gold. That's going to be really important as we go through history here. It also provided credit to businesses who wanted to borrow money to expand, or farmers or something. It provided loans, essentially. And it restrained other banks. It put rules on what other banks could do. Jackson hated the bank. There were actually two types of people who hated the bank. People who wanted soft money hated the bank because it made everyone else stop printing money, and it made it harder for farmers or businessmen to get loans. And so some people said the bank is a problem because we need more money printed. We need inflation. We need it easier to get your hands on money. There was another type of people who hated the bank for the exact opposite reason. And these are called hard money people. And they are opposed to all paper money. They talk a lot about saving and responsibility. They don't like debt. They don't like loans. And they don't like little pieces of paper that are worth anything. They believe we should be dealing with gold. Jackson was a hard money guy. Back, when he was a farmer earlier in his life, he had gotten himself massively into debt. And when farm prices collapsed, he had lost everything because he had a lot of debt. And after that point, he became fanatically obsessed with the idea that debt was bad. The bank was run by a man named Nicholas Biddle, who was a Philadelphia aristocrat and had a horrible understanding of politics. He basically spent all his time around extremely wealthy people, and he didn't really care what other people thought. He hired Daniel Webster, the great Whig senator from Massachusetts, to be the bank's lawyer. And Webster would get Henry Clay involved. And so Webster and Clay are the two main supporters of the bank. Webster because he's getting paid to be. In 1836, the charter for the bank is going to expire, and Congress is going to have to make the decision to give the bank a new charter and keep it going, or let the bank die, which is what happened to the first bank. Webster and Clay get Biddle to ask for the charter 4 years early. Now, the reason they're doing this is they know that Jackson hates the bank. And so they're going to pass the charter through Congress, and Jackson will either have to veto it or sign it. If he signs it, he's going to make all his anti-bank constituents angry. And if he vetoes it, he's going to crash the economy. Now, they're doing this in 1832 instead of 1836 because they're trying to win the election on this issue. They want to make Jackson the bad guy in the bank war and then run against that when Clay runs for president. Jackson vetoes the bill, and they try to override it in Congress to make Jackson appear weak. But Jackson is able to hold his supporters in line and prevent the Congress from overriding the veto. When the economy goes bad, Jackson appeals directly to the people, publishing, they probably didn't write them, but articles in the paper and giving speeches blaming Nicholas Biddle and his bank for all their problems. And Biddle and the Bank of the United States ends up being seen in the minds of most people as the enemy. Jackson and Martin Van Buren crush Henry Clay in the election of 1832. And Jackson wins re-election. Jackson is so angry about this, he can't wait to kill the bank. It's going to die in 4 years anyway, because that's when the charter runs out, but he wants to make sure it dies. And so he orders his Secretary of the Treasury to take all of America's money out of the Bank of the United States and put it into smaller state banks that are called his pet banks. The Secretary of the Treasury says that's a terrible idea and refuses. So he resigns. The Secretary of the Treasury quits. So then Jackson turns to the assistant, says, "You're not Secretary of Treasury, you do it." And he quits. The Attorney General of the United States, Roger Taney, will say, "I'll do it." And so he becomes the new Secretary of the Treasury. He takes the federal government's money out of the Bank of the United States and he puts it into these small state banks. Biddle, in order to try to keep the Bank of the United States alive, starts calling in loans, meaning you have a loan that you're paying off over 10 or 20 years. Biddle says we have to have the money now. He raises interest rates, and this is what collapses the economy. Biddle ends up taking the blame, as he's the one calling in the loan, so they see him as the bad guy. And this destroys any chance that the bank is going to be back. Tawney, for his part, as you can see, is rewarded for this act by becoming the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court when John Marshall dies. Now, we'll talk more about Tawney and his decisions, but one of his very first decisions is fascinating. It's the Charles River Bridge versus the Warren River Bridge in 1837. Earlier, one of these companies had been granted a monopoly to build a toll bridge, so you had to pay to use the bridge across the Charles River. Years later, the Massachusetts legislature decides to build a free bridge. The original bridge sues, saying, no, the government gave us a right to have the only bridge across this river and force people to pay for it. Now, Marshall would have clearly said, contract, you can't do anything, there can't be a free bridge. He clearly would have ruled in favor of the toll bridge. Tawney says that the purpose of the government is not to enforce contracts. The purpose of the government is to serve the public good. Jacksonian democracy. The government exists for the people, not for the elites, as the Federalists seem to think. And so Tawney rules in this case that the contract for the monopoly with the original bridge for the toll does not serve the public interest, and he allows the free bridge to be built, striking a significant blow to John Marshall's view of how law should work in America.